Hi, everybody. We're going to talk about iterators today. I hope you're doing okay. I know a lot of you are stressed out. I said this last time, but just want to reiterate that we're all in this together and we're all experiencing similar things. So we're going to talk about iterators today. And the iterator is a feature in Java that is used by all of the built-in collections. So all of the collections that we are studying, lists, and we'll talk about sorted lists and trees. One that you have already used is the array list. They all use this same mechanism to provide a means of looping through and accessing every item in the collection. So for the iterator, we need two parts. One part is the class that's going to be iterated over. So think of our list. The list has to create an iterator to work with the list. And so that's one side of it. And then we need the actual iterator itself, which is an object separate from the list that is created to do the iteration. So before we talk about putting that together, let me show you an example of a list and an iterator. So for the list, it needs to have this method, iterator, that returns this iterator object. And the iterator object is linked to the list because the iterator object is going to have, and these methods will look familiar to you also from the scanner class. These are the methods of the iterator object. So the iterator object has a hasNext method that tells you whether there's anything left that hasn't been looped through yet. And the next method that says, here's the next thing. So those are within the iterator object. The iterator method in the list is going to create the object that has that method, these methods. Of course, there has to be some link between the two because these methods are going to be accessing the objects inside the list. So before we talk about that, let me show you a program that has a couple of lists, and each one has an iterator. So we have two lists. I called them one list and two list. And I happen to make one an array-based list and one a linked list, but they will work the same way in terms of the iterator. So for one list, I added 5 items to the list. These are lists of strings. I put flower in position 1 so that actually, remember, the add method adds them at the end, but this one will put the 1 in the second position of the list. And then for my other list, I added some items, also 5 items. The last item there I put in the front of the list. So now I have these two lists. Oops, sorry. And here's where I'm going to iterate through the first list. So here's where I create the iterator. So one list is the list. We use its iterator method, and it returns an object of type iterator. Actually, iterator is an interface. So this is a specific type of iterator object that implements the iterator interface, right? So we have our list. We have the iterator method that returns the iterator object. And then we use the iterator object to loop through all the items in one list. So we use has, next, and next. We're going to print all of those items out. Because I created this iterator with one list, it's going to loop through the items from one list. How about two list? I create and use an iterator for that, but I did it a different way. So this is what we call the enhanced for loop. The enhanced for loop says for every item in this collection, so for every string in toList, execute the loop once. So this one actually includes some stuff that we had to do explicitly up here. Here it's done implicitly. So we didn't even have to actually explicitly create the iterator. And we didn't actually explicitly have to call the has, next, and next methods. Okay, so let's see the output from this program. And you can see, let's see if I can get these both. 1 second. Okay, so here's one list. And we looped through that list and printed everything. Notice flowers in the second position because I added it in position 1. And here's toList. And notice that cash is in the beginning because I added it in position 0. So each of these iterators loop through, and when we got the item out of the list, we printed it. Okay. So that's how we use an iterator. So how do we create the iterator? All right, so there's a couple ways to do it. We are actually going to look at 2 of the ways to do it. We're not going to look at the anonymous in our class. We're going to skip over that this time. So inside the list class, we have an iterator method. And that creates and returns the iterator object. So we need a class to create the iterator object, and that class has to have access to the fields of the object it's iterating over. So we go back here. This iterator has access to the fields of one list, and the iterator that we're using here, which we didn't create explicitly, has access to the fields of toList. Okay, so remember in our array-based list, we have 2 fields that we're going to need to work with. The array that contains all of the elements in the list and the number of elements in the list. Okay, so one thing we can do is create an iterator in a separate class. So here's my iterator. So I'm going to call it AB list iterator since it iterates over the AB list. It needs to implement the iterator interface. The iterator interface says I have a has next method and I have a next method. Okay, and it has to work with a specific AB list. So what we do is we create a link between the list iterator and the list itself. And I actually made a picture for you, so let's see. Here's a picture that represents that. So here's the list object, say one list. It has 5 items. I didn't put the items in. You saw how bad the drawing was last time, so I skipped over that. But we remember that we have 5 elements in our list. The iterator method creates the iterator object. In our case, we called it oneIter. The iterator object has the next and the hasNext methods, and it also has a field that is a reference to the list that it's going to iterate over. So that field allows these methods to access the items in the list. So if I create an iterator for a different list, say like toList, it's going to have the same structure, but instead of referencing this list, it would be pointing to another list, and when next and hasNext execute, they would be iterating over the items in that other list. Okay, so how do we get that link? How do we get this to happen? We're going to do that in the constructor. So when the iterator method here executes and creates the iterator, it's going to pass a reference to itself, which is this, to the constructor. And when the constructor of this object executes, it will set up that link. So here's what we have. Here's my iterator. Here's my reference to the list I'm going to iterate over. And I have to keep track for myself for the next and hasNext. How far have I gone through the list? So I'm going to start out saying the previous item, which I have iterated over, is in position -1, which means I haven't iterated over anything yet. So here's my constructor. In my constructor, I have to have the list that I'm going to iterate over, and I'm going to save that in my field here. So how about hasNext? hasNext says if the previous item that I iterated over is not at the very end of the list, right? So the list.size says how many items are in my list. The list.size -1 says what's the subscript of the last item. And if the previous position is less than that, it means there's at least one more item to iterate over. Okay, and how about next? Next has to get the next item and return it. So next says, let me increment the position and return the element at that position. That's it. Okay, so I'm going to go into the list and I'm going to return that item at that position. Next time I call hasNext, right, it will check the last time I did a next. Was I at the end? And if not, I'll move down again and return the next one. Okay, so the iterator method inside the list now is pretty simple. What it has to do is create one of these, right? It has to create one of these objects. And it has to pass itself to the iterator that it's creating. So that's the iterator, and it's in a separate class from the list itself.